o'clock, we call this board meeting to order. As you join me in the pledge of the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Here.
Mr. Harrington?
Here.
Mr. Maryhill?
Here.
Mr. Gardner?
Here.
Mr. Douglas?
Here.
Mr. Farabee?
Here.
Mr. Blades?
Here.
Mr. McNally?
Here.
Mr. Skazbaba?
Here.
Mr. Cannon?
Here.
Mr. Paliti?
Here.
Mr. Moore?
Here.
Mr. Marnell?
Here.
Mr. Whitson?
Here.
Mr. Grinnell?
Here.
Mr. Connell?
Here.
Mr. Gilliland?
Here.
And Mr. Preston?
Here.
Thank you.
We do have one guest, Assemblyman Dan Steck is here. Dan, do you want to speak to the board now or after? I told Dan in a text the other day we'd give him courtesy of the floor to speak what he's up to in Albany. About 12 to allow Mr. Steck to...
Yes, you do.
Thanks, Chairman. Mostly wanted to just come in, wish everyone well. I know you're wrapping up your budget process as we're about to gear up for our own down in Albany. I think we had a good year from an infrastructure standpoint in the county. A lot of state money's coming in, Route 9, 28N, 73, clearly Whiteface Highway, and then clearly next year we're staring at some aggressive projects continuing on 73. I know that you guys have been following it pretty closely, but Route 73 is going to get a lot of bridge work next year, which is needed. But of course, with that is going to come the inconvenience of trying to thread that needle and making sure that the road works while we're repairing the bridges. So I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that my office were standing by to coordinate with you and DOT to make sure that they don't forget that there's people and businesses, and my personal opinion is they know that. I mean, you guys worked with them for many years, especially the last couple years on a lot of big projects, so you know that, but just wanted to make sure that you knew my office was ready to handle that. And of course, I know that hand in hand with that, there's some signage issues that continue. I hate bringing them up because they've been kicking around so long, and we still don't have a good answer to them. But mostly just to, wish everyone that y'all had a good Thanksgiving, and as we head into the holidays, have a good holiday, and just checking in, and don't ever be shy about giving me a ring. Any questions, though, while I'm here?
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Steck? Mr. Grinnell?
Dan, do you think there's a possibility of really seeing mandate relief in the coming year, or are we still going to hold the bag on that?
Well, that's, it's coming from local government and now being there. I mean, I've been disappointed in the amount of mandate relief that we haven't seen. That song hasn't changed. I think they're a little more mindful of it. They play a little more lip service, if you will. But as far as, implementing new ones, but as far as rolling back old ones, they're still worried about making the numbers work down there, and unfortunately, I think that they're going to continue to lean on local municipalities with the mandates that they've got. So, the short answer, Bill, is I wouldn't count on a lot of mandate relief. I'm not seeing it happening so far. The big push next year as far as the budget's going to be is trying to do right by our schools. The gap elimination adjustment is something that all your school superintendents know. That's the first three words out of their mouth anytime I've ever met with any of them the last couple of years, and that will continue to be an issue. New York City, that's not as big an issue for the bigger school districts. That's a different formula that they worry about. So that's the tug of war that we've got in Albany is, gap elimination adjustment versus foundation aid. And, but that's, as far as the schools go, that's the big thing. This Tier 6 is supposed to help, but that, like a lot of other things, that'll take time to phase in. So I mean, any game changers coming that I think in the area of mandate relief, I don't think any game changers. I think if anything, we might continue to nibble at the edges. So for your own planning purposes, I hope for the best, but, plan for status quo. That's all I can say.
Anybody else? Comments, questions? Dan, thank you very much, and thanks for all you do for us, and great correspondence. You're always very cordial in getting back and very helpful, very assist us in any of our needs. So I thank you for your leadership.
Thanks for your patience, and I'll stick around and catch you guys after the meeting too.
Thanks, you. With that said, we'll move to resolutions.
Resolution number 301, authorizing the Public Health Department to apply for and accept a 5-year WIC grant from New York State Department of Health Center for Environmental Health, and further authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute the same.
Moved by Mr. Blades, second by Mr. Harrington. Under discussion. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Plea?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 302, adopting and approving quality improvement reviews and policies, procedures for the Certified Home Health Agency and preventive services approved by the PAC.
Moved by Mr. Maryhill, second by Mr. Connell. Under discussion. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried.
Resolution number 303, authorizing appointments to boards, committees, and/or councils.
Moved by Mr. Preston, second by Mr. Grinnell. Under discussion. Roll call vote, please.
Just a moment. Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. 303. Resolution 304, authorizing budget amendments for various departments.
Moved by Mr. Skozavala, second by Mr. Grinnell. Under discussion. Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 305, amending resolution number 79 of April 7th, 2014 to correct the amount of $20,355 Eat Smart New York funds, which were inadvertently increased in the 2014 budget. It was originally 2013 funds.
Moved by Mr. Marnell. Second by Mr. Connell. Under discussion. Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 306, authorizing the chairman of the board to enter into an agreement on behalf of Essex County with the New York State Office of Children and Family Services for the 2014 Comprehensive Plan for Youth Development Program funding as provided for in the 2014 Essex County budget.
Moved by Mr. Harrington, second by Mr. Whitson. Under discussion. Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 307, accepting, adopting, and placing on file policies, plans, procedures, and annual reports.
Moved by Mr. Cannon, seconded by Mr. Grinnell. Discussion. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried.
Resolution 308 of appreciation to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation under the direction of Bob Stegman and Joe Martins for all of their help and support.
Moved by Mr. Cannon and Mr. Moore. Second. And a second, thank you.
Resolution 309, authorizing a payment to Bell and Flynn Incorporated for additional work performed on the Stickney Bridge Road project in the amount of $20,630.
I'll move that. There's a second. Second by Mr. Morrow. Under discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 310, authorizing the Department of Public Works to purchase parts and labor from Security Concepts in an amount not to exceed $10,136.08 from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Cannon. Second by Mr. Maryhill. Under discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Abstain.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 311, authorizing the purchasing agent to go out to RFP for the replacement of 4 doors at the County Complex Building.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Gardner. Under discussion? Under discussion, I have not spoken to Chris yet. I know that's what you're gonna ask, right there.
Maybe Dan,
D&B is what you're talking courthouse?
yeah, our automatic door is required. I mean, because we have none over there, and I had a call from one of my constituents saying that, they were in a wheelchair. And
I'm not sure. I know that when that building was built, it was built to handicap standards, so I would never be surprised if it was required, but it didn't. But I'll check.
Okay, thank you.
If not, my understanding is that we might as well put it out in the bid package. Is that what you want to do? Just to see what the price would be in case we're... So can we...
So you want to amend this to add?
To add the courthouse D&B. Somebody want to move that amendment? Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Skozavala. All in favor to the amendment? Aye. Now on the resolution is amended. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried. Thank you.
Resolution 312, authorizing the Department of Public Works to contract for shared services between the Sheriff's Office for clerical work.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Maryhill and Mr. Skozavala. Under discussion? All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion's carried.
Resolution 313, authorizing the clerk of the board to purchase a Kia Sierra 65011 copier from SimQuest in the amount of $8,895.44 with a .00049 per copy maintenance contract from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Marnell, second by Mr. Whitson. Under discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 314, authorizing the county attorney to acquire the Old County Infirmary Cemetery property in the town of Essex through the power of eminent domain.
Moved by Mr. Gardner, second by Mr. Gilliland. Under discussion? Mr. Skozavala?
Eminent domain is probably a dirty word. Have we exhausted all of our options to not have to go through with an eminent domain proceeding? Have we sat down and really discussed this with the owner to see if there's other arrangements that can be made?
I think you all have a copy. I sent at the end of November a letter to the property owner informing her that, the property is, I think, 18 acres in total. and I've been led to believe that the cemetery comprises approximately 2 acres. So I had written the owner a letter asking her if there'd be the possibility that she and I could meet, or if she didn't want to meet with me, she and a representative of the county, so that we could amicably come up with a solution to the problem where she would convey us the property. We would pay for everything involved, which might entail APA jurisdictional matter. If the town of Essex has a local zoning law, subdivision law, we'd have to go to the town of Essex, subdivide that area out. If an easement right-of-way is needed, I don't know the exact lay of the land yet. I have the deed, I have a couple of maps. If an easement right-of-way is needed, then we would want to have that in the deed. And try to come to some sort of resolution to this, which is mutually beneficial to everyone. Because it looks like, we're going to try to take it one way or the other, and it would be better and then we would pay her the fair market value for the property, which would be established by appraisal. We can't pay, so that's been done. I have not had a response. I believe I sent that out on the 24th of November. So, with the holidays and everything, I haven't had a response. I've spoken to the New York State Department of State Division of Cemeteries, and they were no help. They could give me no additional avenues to approach this matter. There are other things, as you know, Town Law 291 allows the town itself to maintain the property pretty much. County Law 222-5A allows the county by a 2/3 vote to provide for the perpetual care, maintenance, etc. of the property. We could go that route, we could dig it ourselves, and we could force a lawsuit, or we could ask the court for a declaratory judgment on this as to what exactly the rights would be of the town or the county as far as this maintenance and how far we can go. But I don't get the sense that that's what's wanted. I get the sense that we want to own this property in fee forever, and so that is another option. Other things have crossed my mind that I haven't had a chance to research. I don't know how legitimate they are, but I've looked through the old files, and the property was conveyed. In the files, there's conflicting correspondence. It looks as though that property was not supposed to be conveyed. It went to the IDA, and then the IDA sold it. It looks as though at the first draft of the deed, and I don't have that draft, but there's a letter that says it was not in the first draft. The cemetery portion was not in the first draft. But then I think at the request of the new property, of the purchasers, that it was placed in there, and that's the way it was transferred. So these other things I'm thinking of are, is this a public cemetery? Is this a private cemetery? What are the definitions? There really aren't any good ones. There's all sorts of law on what can be done with a private cemetery. Oftentimes people buy big tracts of land or old farms, and you may have 4 or 5 people buried there, and you can't mess with that. That's got to be fenced in, and so I haven't had any answers, and I'll pursue whether a cemetery can actually be sold by a county, and whether this was public or private. That gets muddy. And then also, one other thing that occurred to me is, I have some other thoughts, so that's where I'm at. So we'll be pursuing it, and hopefully I will contact the property owner, this time by phone, and see if we can get together and come to some sort of resolution.
So it sounds like this would be a last resort.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nobody likes to institute eminent domain proceedings, but if that's the board's wish, and this property, it looks like it was erroneously conveyed. It wasn't the intent of this board anyway. It appears to be that way.
In 1985 this happened, right?
1985, yes. Then I've been authorized to pursue it through eminent domain, we'll proceed that way, but we only want the 2 plus or minus acres. That's all. We don't want the house, and I'm sure we'd make it nice.
Mr. Kennedy?
Yeah, I think this resolution simply provides the option and makes it clear that it's the desire of this board to acquire that property. So it gives you another bullet in the gun, if you will.
Yeah, this resolution, in my mind, does not preclude me from trying to negotiate
Exactly.
something that's beneficial to everyone. I mean, that just authorizes me to do the most drastic if we can't get anywhere. It's like any lawsuit or any dispute.
Mr. Mayor, you?
You know, and I can appreciate all the time Dan has put into this, but I think we should have a drop-dead date when they do not seem receptive or they're still in a gray area whether or not they're going to do this or not going to do this. I think they need to see a date, whether it's the 30th of January or whatever, that you've had all the time you need to get back and communicate with our county attorney, and at that point, the legal process will begin. I just think that they need to see an end point where they have that ability to respond. Otherwise, it's going to take a long time. I think we need a date.
Yeah, I didn't include one because I didn't want to appear heavy-handed. I want to appear and do want to work with this woman and try to come to a fair resolution. If we don't have anything soon, I certainly will say, look, then our only other alternatives are these, and I've been ordered to begin proceeding.
Thank you. Mr. Grinnell?
The only thing I would say to that is I agree with Noel that we should put a date to it. A different perspective from the owner's point of view might possibly be what difference does it make how I respond? They've already taken the move. They are going to go with eminent domain when they read this. That's why I'm thinking that this may be a little premature before you have a date for them to respond. You may scare them away with this.
Mr. Skozawa?
Coming from a community that has many abandoned cemeteries, we had a couple different situations since I've been in office that the cemeteries were on private land, and the statute clearly is on the side of the community because we are responsible to maintain an abandoned cemetery. And there's different, as Dan knows, criteria as to what qualifies a cemetery as it's been abandoned. But, I negotiated with the owner of the property, and they gave us the right of way to get in there. And so I'm just saying, nobody in the Adirondacks likes the word eminent domain, so I'm glad to hear the county attorney's going to do everything in his power to not have to use that. And I agree with Mr. Cannon. There probably is some ammunition that we may need down the road, and hopefully this will resolve the problem.
Anybody on this side? John? No? Ms. Cordero? No. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried.
Resolution 315, introducing proposed local law number 4 of 2014 entitled Essex County Best Value Procurement Law.
Before we move with this, Noel, did you want that as an amendment, or you just making a comment so that...
I was making a comment. I'm satisfied, didn't want to offer an actual amendment to it. So let the process work.
Thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead, Judy.
Can we read it again?
Yeah, please, I'm sorry.
Resolution number 315, introducing proposed local law number 4 of 2014 entitled Essex County Best Value Procurement Law.
Anyone want to move that? Moved by Mr. Moore, second by Mr. Tillman. Under discussion. Mr. Grinnell.
I've been doing a lot of reading about this proposed best value procurement law, and I kind of, in my mind, it's anything but best value. It's advertised as having nearly half of the states approving it. From another point of view, that would be less than half the states have approved it, or almost half the states, or the majority of the states have not approved it. It has a lack of information in the fact that the purchasing agent shall develop procedures, and we don't know what those procedures are going to be. And I've seen them described where professional judgment is used in the review of the bids. I don't know whose professional judgment, be it the board's or the purchasing agent or the county manager or who, but that's not even defined. I've seen it where product knowledge, if you know another product better than the one that's been bid on, you can ignore the low bid and go forward. There's a laundry list of actions that can be taken that to me are of a suspect nature that would allow nothing less than avoidance of the low bid procedures that we now have. Another question I have is, I'm sure that everybody in this room sitting here right now is of the highest moral and ethical standards. Who's going to replace us? Are they going to be of the same character? Or are they going to take advantage of something we adopt? I think this is the beginning of a very slippery slope, and I don't want any part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grinnell. Mr. Scozzamama.
I've done a lot of research on this also after Mr. Grinnell raised some of his concerns about it. And, does it have some gray area? Absolutely, as do RFPs. But I believe that this here, in conversations that I've had with our purchasing agent, Linda, she informed me that it's a tool that if needed, we have it, will very seldom be used. There are a couple situations here where we could have used it. In the entire bid process, I've gone with many projects where you had to go with low bid and ended up that, you usually end up doing a lot of amendments to the original contract and change orders and so on. And of course, I can't leave this issue without John Glenn's quote when he was sitting at the top of the rocket. They asked him, what was going through your mind? And he said, the only thing going through my mind was it was the low bidder that built this thing. So, I think it's something that, if our purchasing agent feels that it's needed, then I certainly will support it.
Mr. Grinnell.
I'd point out one thing. When John got back, he thought they'd done one hell of a job.
Good point. Anybody on this side? Mr. Pugliese?
I'd like to hear from the county manager, please.
Again, for me, this is really just another tool. It's really a refinement of the RFP process. You have to understand that there are certain things that we're going to go out for that are not even going to qualify to be used. This would not even be qualified to be used. There are certain things that we do as a low bid, purchase of vehicles, those kinds of things. Those are low bid. They will remain low bid. These are really, for me, this is just another tool to refine the RFP process, which the RFP process leaves some things lacking for us. In particular, what it leaves lacking is the ability to piggyback off of contracts that have already been done in other locales, in other states, or other states or in other counties or other jurisdictions. So again, for us, it's just another tool. Ultimately, we still have to come back to the board. This is not something where you're allowing the purchasing agent or the county manager to authorize purchases based upon this. It still requires a resolution of this board to do. We still have to answer to you when we do it. And so, again, it's just something that works for us, I believe.
Yeah, I understand Mr. Grinnell's concerns, but those concerns can be raised at any current mechanisms that we have with respect to procurement. So procurement can be manipulated even at the bidding under 103 of the General Municipal Law or under RFPs under 104. So I do understand the concerns, but my personal opinion is that this is good for the county. This gives us one more mechanism from which we can evaluate the purchases of both goods and services. As Dan said, this sort of is an RFP for the purchase of goods and a little bit of a clarification or a not a clarification, but a little bit step further on the RFP process. The evaluation, Mr. Grinnell is correct, in the local law itself, it does not have the evaluation process as depending on what goods you purchase or what services you're purchasing, your evaluation process might be different. We leave that up to our purchasing agent, Linda Wolf. Generally, in the purchase of goods, you're still going, in the purchase of everything, you're still going to use a point system, I'm assuming, and probably 70% of that point system will be based on the lowest, the price aspect. The other 30%, generally, according to the models, is based on a set of criteria, which to date we cannot use under General Municipal Law 103 for bidding. And those types of criteria are things such as delivery terms, installation costs, long-term costs of the municipality, reputation of the offerer, the quality and reliability of the offerer's goods, past relationships with the municipality, knowledge of regulatory requirements, all sorts of different criteria. Now, those criteria will also be listed in the solicitation for the bids or the request for proposals. So they'll be listed, and then they will be given points. So I think it's good. There are instances where buying at the lowest responsible bidder is, in my opinion, you're not getting what you should get, but we've had to buy it. So this will give us some flexibility in situations where it's warranted. And then finally, as Dan said, and probably most importantly, is we will not be able to piggyback upon other municipalities' contracts outside of New York State without this. Well, not all of them. As you said, 50%. I don't know that to be true, but I take your word for it. 50% of those we would not be able to piggyback upon if we didn't have a best value local law in place. As the piggybacking law that just was enacted, I think in 2012, requires that if you're going to piggyback on someone outside your jurisdiction, they have to have a purchasing mechanism, best value, similar to yours. So that's primarily why they want this, and so you're going to have to trust your purchasing agent and your county manager.
Anybody else on that side? Mr. Grinnell, go ahead.
A couple of things after the comments that have been made. We now know from our attorney and our county manager that there are no procedures developed as to how this law is going to work for us. We're going on the assumptions that we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and there's no criteria set for who or what determines whether we use this particular process. It's also going to be used so we can piggyback on someone else's judgment as to how to bid for a particular item without knowing who is setting that criteria to bid on that item. I think we would be much better served to rely on our own expertise than somebody from who knows where in the state. I don't believe this is the right way for purchasing to take place with taxpayer dollars.
Mr. Mayor, you had something?
Prior to that, it was, my thought process is 99% of the time we'll probably use a low bid situation, just like the copier, just like state contracts and things like that. But certain times we're going to have to encounter decisions very similar to the Circle contract, where you just cannot come up with who's got the lowest dollar because there are so many variables, and I see that this would be the applicable time to use this type of procedure. Not very often, but once in a while we are presented with a thing where a low bid just cannot be quantified because of the variables that are involved in the procurement that we're trying to receive. So I would support that, so.
Mr. Marnell?
Presently, we can buy it from any contractor in New York State. Is that right, Dan? Yes. But this would allow us to go outside the state. I would rather keep all the business we can in the state, as close to our area as possible, but New York State has needs of almost everything that's needed to run any municipality. So I'd rather keep it, try to stay right within the state.
Just a few points. We currently have an RFP process. The criteria for RFP is generally based upon a point system and other objective criteria that are listed in the RFP as it goes out. So that's the same thing with best value. We are going to have a point system and objective criteria that everyone will know. Now, everyone knows it's difficult to evaluate this criteria, but you have to rely on your purchasing agent to do that. So best value, the criteria won't be any different than what we have for an RFP process. The only thing that's a bit different as this best value also can be for the purchase of goods, which is not an RFP process. RFP goes through 103 of General Municipal Law, which is bidding. So it's like an RFP process for bidding and like an enhanced RFP process for RFPs. So you've got to just rely upon your purchasing agent to set that criteria and to honestly evaluate it. The second point I think Mr. Grinnell raised was regarding the piggybacking. And I agree that, you know, the evaluation and the selection by an out-of-state purchaser, municipality, is they have done that. But that's the whole theory behind piggybacking anyway. Piggybacking within a state contract. You may piggyback on a Clinton County contract. That allows you don't have to worry about it. The law takes into consideration that they've done it correctly, you can piggyback. So that's the same theory here. Mr. Grinnell makes valid points about, there can be manipulation of the process if anybody can manipulate these processes. But my opinion is that it's good for us in certain circumstances.
Dan, on the radios, my colleague here mentioned that as well. If we had best value, would it have had a different scenario, different outcome?
Me? I mean, what radio, the whole project, or?
Well, on the mobile radios that we awarded to Wells as opposed to the other one, truthfully, I don't know how much difference it would have made at that point, because, again, when you're getting ready to go out, you develop the criteria based upon what you're purchasing. So when we did the RFP for that, one of the things we considered within the RFP is experience and training, and how much training does your techs have, and those kinds of things. That would have been worked into a best value procurement anyways, I think, and would have been awarded some points based upon that as well. So I don't know that it would have made much difference. Ultimately, with that particular project, the high bidder was in the review that Linda and I did and a few other people, we didn't think was the best value. We really felt like,
And that was an RFP process and not a formal bid, but if we'd done a formal bid under that with best value, we could have chosen the best value for service and everything else, all the issues that we had to come back here and discuss again.
That would have been
Right, thank you.
more clarified.
Anybody else?
I would just say on the whole criteria thing, the reason why you're not identifying the criteria now is because everything you purchase will be different, whether it's a service or whether it's a particular item or whatever that is. You have to determine at the time you go out what criteria you're going to use to either, because some things you buy that don't need installing, for example. Other things you buy you do need to have installed, so that's going to result in a different criteria.
Well, ask for a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
No.
Mr. Grinnell?
No.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Sorry. Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 316, authorizing the ratification of a contract renewal with Fiscal Advisors and Marketing Incorporated relative to services for issuance of bonds.
Somebody want to move this? Moved by Mr. Moore, second by Mr. Cannon. Under discussion. Mr. Skozavala.
This, is this for the issuance of bonds that we just, or is this for a year, or for how long? I mean, what is this?
This definitely has...
This for?
Yeah, this definitely has to be passed now because it's for the issuance of the current bonds that we've gone out to solicit. And I don't know if it's a 1 year or a 3 year contract.
We're still under contract with Fiscal Advisors they do all of our bonding?
Well, there's two different things here.
Right.
This is only for the purpose of these people giving an opinion to the people bidding on our bonds as to whether we're fiscally, what our fiscal rating would be. And that's what drives your rate either up or down based upon your condition. These people do that. That's the service they provide. Ken Bond is our bond attorney that's a different service. That's not this particular one.
Okay. Thank you.
We do have another contract with them also, and it's a peripheral issue. I don't remember what it is, but I have it in the file. So we need them. We will go out to bid after this one, and there are a few other things we'll have to go out to bid for.
Thank you.
Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
He stepped
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 317, accepting the mortgage tax report.
Moved by Mr. Palady, second by Mr. Morrow. Under discussion. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 318 of appreciation to Luann Dickinson upon her retirement from service with Essex County.
Moved by Mr. Blades. Thank you.
Resolution 319 of congratulations and appreciation to Donald Marquica for his 36 years of service with Essex County.
Moved by Mr. Connell. Unanimous second. Thank you.
Resolution 320, resolution authorizing a refund. This should be 2013 school taxes for the Osceola Valley School District to Mark and Melissa Hodgson.
I'd like to move that. Second. Mr. Morrow. Discussion. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady? Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland? Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 321, authorizing the levy of chargebacks.
Moved by Mr. Mayhew, second by Mr. Skozavala. Under discussion. Mr. Skozavala.
Yeah, just on the discussion, this, because we allow the chargeback, actually, I think the county has to for towns, schools, but, just want everyone to be aware that that puts us about 1.5% over our levy, which is added to the levy. So, municipalities obviously are benefiting from this because that's money that we didn't have to show in the levy. So,
Good point, Mr. Scanlon. Anybody else? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 322, reappointing Daniel L. Palmer to the office of Essex County Manager for a term of 2 years.
Moved by Mr. Kane.
Second.
And second. Thank you.
That was easy, Dan. I ought to go in the hospital more often.
There's no rule or anything about it?
I want to make a comment about that. Over the last few years that I've been chairman, there's a lot of meetings that, after board meetings that Dan and Bill have on a lot of issues, and the correspondence is immediate. He's very dedicated to his job, as is Dan Manning, so I think we made a very wise choice, and I'm glad we did it unanimously.
Thank you very much.
Dan says he's agreed, so we got 19 votes. So, I'll count. Move ahead, Judy, sir.
Resolution number 323, authorizing a public hearing to be held on Monday, December 15th, 2014 at 9 a.m. upon the recommendation of the Essex County Agriculture and Farmland Protection Board for the purposes of adding parcels owned by Lori and Michelle Davis to Agricultural District Number 1.
Moved by Mr. Connell. Seconded by Mr. Gilliland. Under discussion. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried.
Resolution 324, setting the date for a public hearing on the 2015 Essex County tentative budget to be held on December 9th at 10 a.m.
Moved by Mr. Gardner. Seconded by Mr. Grinnell. Under discussion.
He's running this one again.
Oh, it was quick. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried.
Resolution 325, authorizing the county chairman or county manager to contract with the Ausable River Association to oversee the completion of the project contained in New York State Department of State Master Contract Number C-100214 for the implementation of the Ausable Watershed Management Plan under the Environmental Protection Fund Local Waterfront Revitalization Program.
Moved by Mr. Farabee. Second by... Anybody? Mr. Harrington. Mr. Moore. Under discussion. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Douglas?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady? Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 326 of condolence to the family of Lauren J. Snow Jr.
I'd like to move that. And the second, thank you very much. Resolution from the floor. Mr. Morrow.
I'd like to have permission to move a resolution of congratulations to Essex County Fish Hatchery Manager Steve Lemire, who was recently named Professional Conservationist of the Year by the New York State Conservation Council.
Do I have 12 to allow that on the floor?
Yes, you do.
Can you get a unanimous second? Second. Thank you. Further resolutions from the floor? There's no further resolutions. Other pertinent business anybody have? We seem to have a lot more audience than we normally do, and this isn't a public hearing, but I am going to give the courtesy of the floor to anybody out there that wants to come and address the board. And Teresa, former Assemblywoman Teresa Sayward, who was former chair of this body, you have the courtesy of the floor. Do I have 12 to allow on the floor?
Yes, you do.
Teresa.
Yep.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank you all for moving the resolution regarding the cemetery over in Wellensburg. But having said that, I think it was maybe 2009, I'm not sure of the date, there was a resolution passed here that this county would look at what they could do about taking back the cemetery. Now we're going to leave here today with not moving forward with eminent domain, which I understand as well as anybody is not a word anybody likes to hear in the Adirondacks. But normally that word is attached to something like taking somebody's home, taking somebody's business, taking property from someone that is equity to them in one way or another. This cemetery has no equity to the individual right now who is in possession of it. You can't do anything in a cemetery in New York State. It's not allowed. I mean, you can't build a building on it. It has no value. All I'm asking this morning, as we leave here, is that we don't have to come back again. Ms. Dickerson was here 3 years ago talking about this. We don't want to wait 3 years. We don't want to have to come back. I know you have a lot of issues. I've sat in your seat. I know there's a million things that you have to do in a day. All I'm asking is that someone, probably Mr. Douglas, just nudge the county attorney, who also has a million things to do, that this should be on the front burner and not on the back burner. I appreciate it, and I thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. The resolution did pass for eminent domain, though. I just want everybody to realize that we are moving forward, and we will put this on the...
We will do that if it doesn't. And just, I was directed to look into this in, I think, 2009 or 11, but no action was taken, so I didn't do anything further. But I will do it. We'll pursue it, just like we pursue everything.
Thank you. Further comments, questions? Anybody have anything? If not, we are adjourned.